Good, excellent. Hello, everyone. I don't know how many people listening were with me last week in the first webinar, but I did explain a couple of points which I will go through again. First of all, this sequence of 3 webinars is very much a sequence. There's a little bit of overlap. There are some slides which will crop up in at least 2, possibly all 3 of the webinars. And there's meant to be a kind of cumulative impact to what I'm saying. Having said that, they're also designed to be standalone, but I think you would get a lot more from each of them if you were able to follow all 3 of them, preferably in sequence 1, 2, 3. And the other point I made was that although I'm a deaf-blind specialist, really I'm talking about children, not even children with complex disability or significant disability or mild to moderate disability. I've been teaching at San Francisco State, and I had my last session with a group of students last night. I've been with them for a whole year. And one of them said at the end that everything we'd covered, although it was about children with deaf-blindness, actually he felt it was relevant to all the children he was working with, none of whom have that diagnosis of deaf-blindness. And then one of the other teachers in the group said, actually, I've been using some of these things with my own 2 children who are developing regularly. And so much of it is relevant. And it was very rewarding for me to get that kind of feedback. So if I keep using the word deaf-blindness, please remember that really almost probably everything I'm going to say is applicable to all children. And I made a point last week that good quality deaf-blind educational practice is good for all children. It's based on a certain philosophy which is respectful and very individualized. And that word individualized will come up again today and again next week. Today I'm talking specifically about assessment, and I did make the point last week that everything I say in a way is about assessment. I'm a synthesizer, and it's very hard for me to isolate any particular aspect of the children or any particular approach, because I constantly see links to the rest of the child or the rest of the curriculum or whatever. But today I'm focusing very specifically on assessment. And I'll say one thing about the presenters' names. You'll notice there are 2 of us. I've put my name down with my colleague, Julie Meyer. And that's because we collaborated on a presentation about assessment, and I've used a number of her slides with her permission in this session. And ironically, I think this week she's giving a webinar for people in Pennsylvania, and she's also using a lot of my slides in her presentation. The other bit of explanation is my title. I've got a quote. You're all familiar with the phrase and the song, possibly, looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. Many, many years ago in London, I was at an IEP meeting for a child, and there was a school psychologist there who was, how can I put it? She seemed to think she was the key player, and she was the one running the meeting, which she wasn't. And we clashed because her view of the child was that the girl was profoundly disabled, doing almost nothing, and needed to be almost in a kind of custodial care situation where she would be kept safe and not stressed with minimal expectations. I disagreed with her very strongly. I'd seen all kinds of abilities and potential in the child, and things got quite heated. And I remember the chair of the meeting calling the meeting to a halt because it got too heated. And many, many years later, probably about 10 years later, I went to another meeting on another child, and the same psychologist walked in, and her face fell and my face fell. She walked over to me and she said very facetiously, "Oh, you're the man who always looks at the children through rose-colored glasses." And what she meant was, I don't really understand the children. I just think nice things about them because that's the way I operate. And I took the phrase as a great compliment, and I've used it ever since. So it was the obvious title for this session. Here are the details of the 2 articles that my colleague Julie and I wrote about assessment. We were both working for California Deaf-Blind Services. We had a magazine called Resources, and we only ever published new material. We never reprinted. So there was an obligation on us to keep writing. And I didn't know she was writing her article, and she didn't know I was writing mine. And we were thrilled when we saw them because they fit together beautifully, almost as if we'd collaborated. So both those articles are in the handouts for this talk, so you've got easy access to them. The population has changed very dramatically. I've been in this deaf-blind field for 35 years, and I've seen the children generally become much more complex and much more medically challenged, mainly, of course, as a result of the progress we've made in medicine and in the kind of medical strategies and techniques and technology that we use to save these children when they're born and keep them alive, and in most cases, ultimately, to discharge them from the hospital setting to go home. And I thought about what kind of medical issues have come up in those 35 years, things I'd never heard of 35 years ago. And the list was actually bigger than the one on your screen, but this is just a sample. Gastrostomy tubes, 24-hour pump feeds, and recently a move towards blended diet, where regular food is put through the feeding tube, tracheostomies, suctioning, ventilators, monitors for blood sugar levels, oxygen saturation levels, and body temperature. And of course, it's the family in most cases who are having to operate all this equipment and make sure that everything is under control and being dealt with. And then the other column, standing frames, walkers, a whole range of orthotics, sensory integration therapy, various hormone treatments, all kinds of drug therapies, shunts for children who've had hydrocephalus, and most recently, cochlear implants. And we used to say that cochlear implants were a science fiction idea and would never actually happen in reality. And of course they did. And then we assumed that the most profoundly disabled children would never be considered as candidates for cochlear implantation. And now those children are included as well. So it's interesting for me to look back and think how much our knowledge base has expanded and how much the assumptions and the presumptions that we had then have been confounded by the children themselves. And then finally, because this is a little bit in the realm of science fiction, ocular implants, the idea of somehow surgically implanting something, probably in the eye, that will enable a blind eye to see. And there are often rumors about blind mice who now see because they have a small camera implanted in their eye. I don't know if any of these stories are true. I prefer to wait until it looks imminent before I worry about these things. But it's quite likely for younger people listening to me today that you will see ocular implants in children possibly before too long. And then I think about the challenges this has created, and in the children especially, we see slower progress and we see a lot more regression, mostly allied to illness and hospitalization issues. There's less time for learning with illness, with absence from school, with surgical procedures in hospital, and so on. For us, there's less chance of developing familiarity with specific disabling conditions. When I came into the field, most of the children I worked with had congenital rubella syndrome. Well, thanks to widespread vaccination campaigns, rubella syndrome is now almost unknown in children in the developed world. But there are many, many more reasons why children are deaf-blind, including a growing number of chromosome abnormalities, many of which are very, very rare and very recently discovered and recently named. So the days when, if you knew rubella syndrome, you were an expert in deaf-blindness, and if you knew deaf-blindness, you were an expert in rubella syndrome, those days are long gone. And thank goodness the internet has come along and helped us deal with this growing number of etiologies in the population that we're working with. There's a need in the children for more one-on-one support for a whole range of reasons. There's much more physical care involved. There are more agencies and more personnel involved. And now if you go to an IEP meeting, it's not unusual to have a family member, usually a parent or maybe both parents, and 18 or 19 professionals. And while it's wonderful that that number of specialists is involved, there are obvious difficulties with coordination, with prioritizing, and with really making sure that opportunities are being maximized and that there's agreement and that we're all pushing in the right direction and thinking in the right direction. And we've had to make significant adaptations to our assessment approaches, our teaching methods, and the kind of communication systems that might be appropriate for each individual child. And this is where our creativity has been incredibly challenged. Because I love this field, I love this work, I've devoted most of my working life to it. And although I retired 3 years ago, I still seem to be doing an awful lot with these children and for these children. I would rather think about what are these changes I'm describing in the population, this growing complexity, what kind of positive things has this offered us? Because I tend only to hear about the negatives. And I came up with this list. It's greatly improved our observation skills. We've had to observe far more closely over much longer periods of time in order to get an idea of who these children are, what's working for them, how they are managing to achieve the things they're doing. And that, to me, is probably the most valuable gift that children have given me over these 35 years. They've also, as I said, they've challenged our creativity enormously. They've taxed our imaginations. Just understanding how certain children do the things they're doing is quite mind-boggling, because they don't appear to have any of the requirements, as we understand it, to be able to do those things. And yet we know they're doing them because we can see them doing them. We've had to be more open and more honest about not knowing. And these days, it's almost a badge of professionalism to be able to say, quite frankly, I don't know, or I've never met this before, or I can't imagine why this is happening, provided, of course, that we then say, let's think about it, let's share, and let's see if we can move forwards. And that, of course, has encouraged our collaboration much more than used to be the case. If we're doing this right, these changes have also increased our empathy on a huge scale, particularly with the families, but also with the professional teams involved. And as a teacher, I'm thinking especially about school teams and educational professionals, but also by extension, the therapy teams and the medical teams who are often in the front line of trying to make sense of what's happening with these children. And finally, the children have continually expanded the parameters of what we thought was possible. If I can think back 35 years, I never would have believed children like children I'm seeing now would be doing the things they're doing. It's extraordinary how they've given us that gift. And it's only a gift, of course, if we welcome it and if we're aware of it and if we accept it. And that's what I'm pushing today very much. This horrible picture is increasingly the first life experience outside the womb for many of the children in the deafblind population. And this isn't their first experience just for a week or two or a month or two, but sometimes for 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, or even 3 years. And a number of children I've worked with in the last couple of years did not come out of a hospital setting at all until they were almost 3 years old. And obviously this has big implications for development. And if you're working in a job like mine as an itinerant teacher and working in homes with families, there are huge implications here for the parents and the other family members. And we really have to develop our understanding of why certain things might be happening and why there might be certain barriers that we're meeting to our ideas or our advice. At the Deafblind International Conference in Toronto in 2003, my professor who trained me at the University of Birmingham, Tony Best, made this statement: deafblindness is a spectrum disability, but the neurological involvement of the vast majority of deafblind people under the age of 10 makes it a medical condition as much as a sensory disability. And I was hoping I would see him last year at a conference, and he wasn't able to come. I know this quote off by heart, and I wanted to quote it back to him and say, did you have any idea 15 years ago how true this was and how it was going to become more and more a fact of our jobs? And those early months and years contain, I won't read this list, but a long list of very negative experiences for the child most of all, but also for the family and the non-medical professionals involved. So that all those really important prerequisites for development, for communication, for social skills, for emotional competence, all those tend to be missing and replaced by very negative, hostile factors. And it's really good for us to remember that. I won't go on. I could do a whole session on these issues. But this is a quote from an article I wrote specifically about children with Charge syndrome. But really it applies right across the whole population of children with deafblindness or who are multisensory impaired. And what I say is children with Charge syndrome are truly multi-sensory impaired, having difficulties not only with vision and hearing, but also with the senses that perceive balance, touch, temperature, pain, pressure, and smell, as well as problems with breathing and swallowing, eating and drinking, digestion and temperature control. It's, I've used the phrase mind-boggling already, but it is truly mind-boggling, trying to imagine what these children are having to go through and deal with, and then trying to understand how are they doing the things they are doing, given all these negative factors. And a reminder, a slide I showed last week, that we are increasingly meeting children who have difficulties with perceiving every one of these senses. And I include proprioception and the vestibular sense and pain. And I explained last week why. And I will be coming back to this next week when I talk more specifically about strategies that children use to reduce stress and to function and to self-regulate. So, why do people assess children with deaf-blindness? I like to ask this question when I'm teaching in class, and it can sometimes take a lot of coaxing by me to get the student teachers to give me a good list. They have 2 or 3 ideas, but that's about as far as their understanding goes. And I think this isn't a comprehensive list, but we can assume that there are people who assess children to determine the need for services or their eligibility for services. And this is an unusual kind of assessment because by definition, if you're looking at eligibility criteria, you have pass or fail criteria. Either the child at the end of the assessment is eligible for that service or they're not eligible. And that makes this a particular kind of assessment, which is not the kind of assessment that I do or have ever done. Everything else on the list is stuff that I'm familiar with doing. So the one that teachers usually get is to provide a baseline of current skills, knowledge, and perhaps experiences in the child. You find out where the child is, where they've got to, where their abilities extend to and then stop. And that gives you your threshold, your baseline. That's where you're going to put your teaching point and start working with them. It's also an approach of assessment to identify the supports and the services needed by the child specifically. It's a way of providing a guide for intervention and instructional techniques to help the child develop more skills and knowledge. Then, after the initial assessment, once you're working with the child, once you're teaching, it should be an ongoing approach to assessment to measure the child's growth and development and skills based upon normative standardized groups or results. There should be some comparison with those norms at some point, but not in a pass or fail way. I really want to stress that. It's important to assess the child's progress, to evaluate the effectiveness of your educational program. And for me, and I'll come back to this at the very end of this webinar, I think assessment is crucially important to help you know how to present the real child to other people, to help you become a powerful advocate for who this child is, what they know, what they can do, and how they're managing to do it. So I go around initially all over the UK and then all over London and Southeast England and then all over California. And I meet children and I look at assessment data and I see all sorts of problems. And first of all, I have to say that deaf-blindness presents a very diverse and complex population. We have children who have the most profound disabilities it's possible to imagine. And we have children who, in spite of their disabilities, are going to university. And they all come under that label of deaf-blindness. So it's an extremely diverse population. And every one of them, including the children who go in, who are academic learners and may be going into higher education, are complicated. And complications can jump up at any moment and cause great confusion in people. Deaf-blindness, the population, presents a very wide variety of idiosyncratic behaviors. Understanding what those behaviors mean is crucially important, and that's one of the goals of assessment, is to work out where are these behaviors coming from and what function do they serve? Why is the child doing them? People doing the assessments usually only know one type of assessment process. They're very rarely deaf-blind specialists, which is why people like me and Robin in Idaho are involved. And that's what they have to fall back on. And often that approach to assessment just isn't effective with a child with complex disability, including deaf-blindness. There are limited resources and assessment tools available. I'll say a lot more about that in a moment. And people often forget the reason why for the assessment. I like to say to people, why are you assessing? Why did you do this assessment of the child? And they need to be able to tell me why. And if they say, because it was her triennial and we had to do it, that isn't the answer to the question as far as I'm concerned. I appreciate there are certain statutory obligations on people to do assessments, but I want to go back to that list I just showed of the typical purposes of assessment and find out which of those things is in your mind when you're doing the assessment. And if the reason why is to discover all the things the child cannot do, which is often the result of inappropriate assessment procedures, then I would say that is not a legitimate reason why you should be doing the assessment. We need to revisit and start again. Because deficit assessment is not acceptable, but is very, very frequently encountered, where at the end of the assessment process, the assessor has a huge list of things the child can't do and maybe a tiny list of things that the child can do. And as I always say, anyone can do deficit assessment. It's not difficult. You need no training. It's the other kind of positive assessment that's difficult and needs a lot of thought and a lot of experience and a lot of expertise. People often ignore the child's motivators. There's almost a feeling sometimes like a kind of Puritan attitude that in an assessment you shouldn't use things the child likes because that's unfair, because you're giving them an advantage. And I've never really understood that. I'm a teacher and I want to work with children and find out their motivators, because then I use their motivators in my teaching. Nothing is more powerful. So to go into an assessment ignoring the child's motivators and refusing to use them, again, is not acceptable to me. The pacing of the assessment is inappropriate. It may take no account of the child's health, their level of alertness, the time of day, the place, the activity, the people involved, and the materials used. I've seen specialists assess a child. They take her away from familiar people. They're strangers. They go into a strange room. They put her on a strange chair at a strange table. They produce a box of equipment that the child has never seen. And then they give directions to the child, and the child is meant to respond appropriately. And I've looked through mirrors and watched these assessments, and I cringe at the complete unacceptability of what I'm seeing. The task is too complicated and too challenging for the child, or the whole session is far too serious and somber. There's no element of play. It's It's clinical in the worst sense of the word. And very often in these situations, there is an expectation that the child will pass or fail. And I always love to boast that no child has ever failed one of my assessments, because failure isn't a possibility, because I'm not interested. There's nothing to fail, because if anything fails, it would be me, because I haven't really found out as much about the child as I was hoping to. But that's very much my failure rather than theirs. And then other things that go wrong. As I've already said, people might have a bank of commercially produced assessment tools. They might be very good, but not really appropriate for this particular child. And I would also say that sometimes the assessment tool isn't really appropriate for the assessor. I've had people recommend assessment tools to me. I once paid quite a lot of money for an assessment tool in England, and when it arrived, I couldn't really understand it. And it went on my bookshelf and it never came off again. And that was the night I learned that the assessment tool had to work for the assessor as well as for the student who was being assessed. Sometimes people think assessment has to mimic standardized clinical assessment procedures. In my article, What Does Follow the Child Mean?, I talk about going into schools, explaining to people that I want to sit in the corner, I'll scribble notes all morning, I'll be observing like a hawk. Everything I write is about the child and what they're doing or not doing, or how they're doing things. And everyone's welcome to look at my notes. There's nothing personal about any of the staff. And then at lunchtime or at the end of the day, we'll sit together and we'll have a meeting. And it's not unusual, after an hour or 2 hours, someone will come over and ask me when I want to start my assessment. And they are, of course, they're under the impression that assessment has a capital A. It's done at a specific time, in a specific place, with specific equipment. And they need a lot of help to understand that observational assessment means observing, noticing, thinking, and interpreting. So the timing can be flexible, the positioning for the child can be flexible, the materials can be anything, and the expected outcomes can be anything. And this is very much the philosophy that Jan van Dijk promoted, and I'll say quite a bit about him in the second hour of this session. The question of positioning, physical positioning, is important, as I explained last week. For all sorts of reasons associated with sensory impairments, children can function much better in some physical positions than other, possibly flat on their backs, on the floor or on a bed, possibly standing. It varies from child to child and moment to moment, but that needs to be explored as a part of the assessment. What kind of physical positions work best for this child in terms of looking, listening, fine hand manipulation, or whatever. They often lack the whole child perspective. There's a belief that if you're assessing a child's vision, you're only really focusing on their eyes. And of course, that might not be the case. The assessor is wearing blinders, so they're doing something. They're administering some kind of input to the child, or they're doing some kind of activity. They've got in mind the response they want from the child. The child may well be responding in some way very nicely, but it's not the response the assessor was thinking about. So they're missing it completely. And I myself am guilty of this. I have video from the 80s where a boy is responding beautifully to me with his feet, but I'm only looking at his arms and his hands. And I keep going and I keep going. And then I turn to his parents and I say, well, he didn't respond today, but that doesn't mean that he couldn't see what I was doing. And the father says, well, he was responding with his feet under the table. And that's how we learn. The assessor may well be assessing the wrong things. And there's that question, what is a response? It's good to go in with that whole child perspective, allowing that the child can do any one of a huge number of things which you will accept as a legitimate response. And if we think about hypothetical children, if children flap their hands, if they understand spoken English but never speak and prefer to sign, if they often get flat on the back on the floor, if they walk on tiptoe more and more as the school day progresses, if they adopt extreme and unusual positions, if they're always removing their hearing aids when they go into the bathroom, that's just a very short list of observations which we need to understand. And if you're assessing a child and they're doing any of these things and you don't understand why, that's what you should be assessing. And I had a quote from Krishnamurti last week about the intelligence of the body. Today, his quote is, "The ability to observe without evaluating is the highest form of intelligence." And I suppose what I'm promoting is the ability to observe without judging, I would say. And all those observations are being filed away, ready for discussion and interpretation, but not for judgment. It's really important to get the wording correct. Now, this is a booklet that's one of the handouts that's available to you for this session, Assessing Communication and Learning in Young Children Who Are Deaf-Blind or Who Have Multiple Disabilities. Charity Rowland, who you may be familiar with, she led this. There was a federal grant, and Charity recruited 4 of the leading figures in deaf-blindness, and they began by surveying many hundreds of people across the United States and said, which assessment tools do you like best for assessing children with deaf-blindness? And when the questionnaire responses came back, they picked the 12 most popular assessment tools, and then they did a critique of each of them. And the booklet takes each of these assessment tools in turn, describes it briefly, describes who it was designed for, and then looks at the advantages and the disadvantages of it when used with children with deaf-blindness. Only 7 of those tools are specifically designed for children with deaf-blindness. The other 5 are for a broader population, but are quite commonly used with this population. And if you want to find a link for this, this is the link where you can let other people know about this booklet. I would really recommend you look through it. And at the beginning of the booklet, they give guidelines for assessment for different people. There's a short chapter, guidelines for parents, guidelines for teachers, guidelines for psychologists, and I think guidelines for social workers. So I would really recommend that. So let's think about 2 possibilities. A deficit finding approach to assessment and a capacity building approach. I'm going to talk about them in some detail. First of all, the deficit finding approach. A deficit model focuses on labels, limitations, barriers, and the needs for remediation. It doesn't recognize nor look for potential, and instead it focusing on goals like fixing things or getting the child ready or helping the child to meet specific criteria. So there's a real focus on how you want to change the child rather than what has this child currently achieved. It views support needs as evidence of the child's problems, and it's intentionally limiting. It wants to look at the gaps so that we can work out how to start filling those gaps. Well, if we think of a different approach, which I'm going to promote in some detail, what about an approach that still builds a learning profile of the child, but a much more positive one, that highlights current skills, current interests, current knowledge, and current experiences? And I would add there, as I'm speaking, I would add current preferences along with interests, because I think they're a little bit different. An approach that focuses on the individual, not on any kind of normed standards. An approach that still identifies the child's needs, but the focus is on identifying the supports needed to help the child to progress. So that's still there, but it's just one of many things in the assessor's mind. And an approach that expects, looks for, and accentuates the child's intelligence, the child's adaptive skills, and the child's potential. And that's what I want to promote. And I should say, while these ideas are very much mine and my colleague Julie's, they really come from mainstream deaf-blind educational thinking, and in particular from Jan van Dijk, but also from other writers in the field. So this is a widely accepted approach in my specialized field. But when I go out into the big bad world, into schools, I find that there's much more of a focus on deficit assessment because of the complexity and especially the multisensory impairment or the deaf-blindness of the child. This is the biggest challenge to effective assessment for everybody. So let's look at the other framework. Now, you've seen deficit, the deficit approach, now the capacity building approach. In contrast, using a capacity model allows you to look for and recognize the unique characteristics, skills, talents, and interests of a child. It focuses on the child's current achievements. It's a way of understanding an individual that assumes their competence and values their contribution and participation. It allows you to recognize potential and possibilities in the child, and it is totally individualized. And if you followed my talk last week, you won't recognize this photograph, but you saw one very similar. This is a child who can't yet walk, but who's understood that to stabilize the head, to stabilize the eyes, to look at the iPad, some creative measures are needed. And these are the creative measures this particular child has come up with at this stage in their development. It's very easy to look at this and think immediately, how can we stop him doing this? To look at it and say, he probably has autism or severe cognitive disability, to come up with a label that fits in more with a deficit approach to assessment and start to say, how can we fix this? Where a capacity model says, first you look at this and say, why is he doing that? And how is he doing that? How on earth did this child manage the amazing postural control and movement abilities? How did this child even think of doing this? I can't give you the answer. I'm still trying after 35 years, but that's the kind of questioning that we should be coming up with. If we use a capacity building framework, first of all, it very actively repositions the student. It almost turns them into a different person or a different being to the one who's on the receiving end of the deficit assessment approach. It removes problems from the students and shifts them to the educational professionals. I'm very comfortable with the idea that if I can't assess a child very effectively, it's my problem and I need to do something about it. And what I need to do about it involves me rather than the child. And as a result, ultimately, it leads to more meaningful and much more student-focused educational decision-making and learning opportunities. And then I have a couple of quotes from my colleague, Julie, from her article. First of all, the idea of presuming competence. Presuming competence is the underlying assumption that even those individuals who behave, move, communicate, learn, and interact with others in different ways share the same human desires we all have for personal growth, for community membership, and for fulfilling relationships and work. And that means work in terms of activity, not jobs. Often these differences disguise the competencies of these individuals due to our society's narrow view of competency, which doesn't allow us to recognize the atypical or unusual skills, abilities, behaviors, and contributions demonstrated by individuals with disabilities as competent or valuable. And that's quite a profound quote and describes the problem very powerfully. And then Julie says, still talking about presuming competence, let's consider the first few weeks that Annie Sullivan spent with the young Helen Keller. What if Annie had only recognized a wild child who held no desire to communicate with others and no potential to learn? What if she believed Helen was only a spoiled child with a bad temperament that would be permanently locked inside herself because she had lost her vision and hearing as a baby? Fortunately for Helen and her family, and for society as a whole, Miss Sullivan took the approach of presuming competence and understood that Helen's different behaviors and actions were certainly a form of communication and an indication of a deep desire to know, learn, and grow. And Julie makes a nice point there at the end about behavior as communication. Accepting that the child's behavior is sending you a message. They might not be intentionally communicating, but if you're open and receptive, and if you believe in this view of children, then everything they do can be assumed to be a message to you, giving you information about them at that moment in time. And then Julie talks about the criterion of the least dangerous assumption. This is a quote from Anne Donnellan. The criterion of the least dangerous assumption holds that in the absence of conclusive data, educational decisions ought to be based on assumptions which, if incorrect, will have the least dangerous effect on the likelihood that students will be able to function independently as adults. In other words, even if the assumptions you make are wrong, they won't be as disastrously bad as maybe some other assumptions you might have made and acted upon. And Julie gives us two different examples of this idea of assumptions. So it's the same child. The first case, a child who has low vision and profound hearing loss is provided with a daily object calendar and is taught tactile signed communication, basic literacy, functional math skills, and the use of a cane for mobility from early school years on. She's provided with daily integration opportunities with same-age peers who are taught how to communicate and engage with her. She receives support from an intervener, and her team regularly meets to discuss her progress and support needs. That word intervener is a specific word in the deafblind field, meaning a one-on-one support worker who is trained to be a deafblind intervener. And if you're interested in that, you can go online and find more and more information about interveners in this deafblind sense. Then Julie says, let's now, still thinking of the same child, still thinking of the same child, now consider that same child assigned all day in a special education class and receiving primarily custodial care with no academic instruction or communication system, because it's assumed that she is, quote, not really aware of anything or anyone around her. So an academic curriculum will be too difficult for her. She must be led by hand to different activities in class and school by whichever staff member is available at that time, because she can't see and hear, and it isn't safe for her to use a cane yet. She plays alone by choice because she is just not interested in her peers. And then Julie asks us the question, which of these assumptions is the most dangerous? And in a way, the second assumption, case 2, is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. This kind of attitude, these kind of, I'll say expectations, but really they're the opposite of expectations. They are going to guarantee that this girl will not progress, will never be able to tackle an academic curriculum, will never develop social relationships, will always need to be led around school, and so on. The first case, even if some of these things turn out to be not fruitful avenues of instruction, there is the possibility that they may pay off. And believe me, after 35 years, I've learned never to assume that any of the things detailed in that first case study might be beyond a child. If you start on the right level, if you break things down, if you present them appropriately, if you give the adaptations and the modifications needed, all sorts of things might indeed be possible. So this lens, as Julie says, this lens is not limited to identifying strengths, but rather it shifts the focus. The view is of the same student, but the perspective is very different. Educators who use a capacity lens look beyond what the student with disabilities is, quote, doing by describing the different or missing skills or behaviors, and instead they consider why the student is or isn't doing something, and then go on to identify and consider systems of support that could enhance and develop the student's capabilities. These educators also understand that the problems that challenge them are the most actual evidence of student capability. I'm sorry, there's two typos in there. That's me. But that is a really good quote about a different perspective, a different lens, a different view of the child, and a whole different set of expectations. It's also, not coincidentally, a far more respectful view of the child than the second case, or than deficit assessment approaches demonstrate. So support needs. You can look at supports, as Julie just said, in two different ways, as signs of need and signs of the child's failures in a way, and a way of putting things right, or in that more positive capacity building perspective. So a deficit framing view judges the type and the intensity of supports as another way to acknowledge the limitations and deficits of the individual. What if supports were viewed as a means to expand the individual's participation and contribution and self-determination? Why is a visual or tactile checklist designed and used to complete a job or a task for the child often viewed as, this person cannot perform this job without help, rather than, whoa, with this checklist, this person can independently complete this job? You can see it might look like a small difference to you, but believe me, really, these two views, these two ways of seeing a child using a specially customized checklist to get through a task, these two views show quite profoundly different attitudes and different expectations. And then Julie makes a nice point at the end that we all rely on supports in our lives, but when the need for supports is viewed just as a deficit or a limitation, then that colors the person's view and perspective of the capacity and contribution of the other person. And I think it is good to be reminded that we all need supports. And for example, I don't do my own plumbing. I don't do my own electrical installation. I don't mend my own washing machine. I believe there are some people who do, but that's definitely not me. We were at the Charge Syndrome Foundation conference in 2013, which I think was in Chicago, I think. No, it was in Arizona, maybe. Anyway, two parents we know did a presentation with their son's team, Jacob. Jacob is a young adult. And they came up with this list of Jacob can. Jacob is very severely affected by Charge syndrome. And as his mom said, there was a widespread feeling that Jacob really couldn't do very much. And when they started this list with his team, the list grew and grew. And as she said to me, I think last year, looking at this list, she said, boy, you'd have to go on to two slides now because it's grown and grown. Partly because he's learning and developing, so his skills are extending and increasing, but also because people who work with him are now getting a better, clearer picture of his potentials and of his abilities. And I'll just read quickly some of the items. He can ride a bicycle. He can get in and out of the car. Grocery shopping, he can take items off the shelves. He can push the cart. He can take you to the carpet or rug aisle, which was a particular tactile favorite of his. He can place items on the checkout belt. He can use his cane, his long cane, for mobility. He can open doors. He can use PECs. He can use some sign language. He puts his own glasses and cochlear implant on, and so on. And then the other column, he can play musical instruments. He can recycle, which he does very efficiently. He can turn on all the lights, and you notice all is underlined because there's a sense of humor here. And you can tell from that comment that this can be a bit of a problem at times, but it's a skill. It's listed as a skill, the things Jacob can do. And then Julie goes on to say, what two views of Jacob, what Jacob can do. And she picks a few items: ride a bike, buckle the seatbelt, use sign language and picture symbols to communicate, put on his glasses and cochlear implant, with some help, wash his hands and brush teeth, shred paper, put away clean dishes, put dirty clothes in the washer and wet clothes in the dryer. The other view is the things Jacob cannot do. He can't drive a car, he can't speak, he can't wash his hands or brush his teeth independently, He can't dress himself independently. He can't read a recipe. He can't cook a meal. He can't shop for groceries, wash dishes, or do laundry independently. And he can't live alone. And the problem with that kind of deficit view is that if you're a teacher, if you're going to educate, if you're going to extend that person's skills, knowing what they can't do doesn't actually give you any idea where to start. It doesn't give you a baseline, because a baseline is based on current abilities, not current deficits. And that ultimately, that means that the deficit assessment is, quite apart from the damage it does, it's completely useless in terms of giving teachers any idea where to start and what to start with, and where to go with what they're doing. So, given these two lists, which one would be more helpful in helping Jacob live a life that will be fulfilling for him and bring him the most happiness? And the answer is obviously the first list, the more positive capacity building list. I've talked quite a bit about language, but I have a slide just to focus specifically on language use and the importance. Language is very powerful, both in spoken and written form. Your words can paint a portrait of capacity that highlights potential and abilities, or your words can paint a portrait of deficits, which focuses on a child's disabilities and limitations. It helps to use person-first language and strength-based descriptions. It helps to focus on abilities, interests, and support needs. And it helps to speak or write in a tone that invites collaboration, discussion, and exploration of possibilities. And at the very end of this webinar, I'll come back to these points using some examples taken from some real IEP reports, assessment reports that were done on a child I worked with. A group of them showing deficit assessment, very much reflected in the language being used, and one showing capacity building perspective at work. And then a couple of points about respect, reciprocity, and respect from the assessor. Remember that others will probably learn more from what they see you do and say than from any training you might provide. When you're involved directly with the student, you are actively modeling, even if you don't know that or don't think of it that way. So you need to be very aware of it. Your responses to the child in typical as well as difficult situations can provide others with information, with strategies, and with confidence to respond and engage with the child during future opportunities. It's always important to point out the child's strengths, the child's attempts, the child's interests, and possible support needs. And it's important to remain positive and respectful and supportive in your interactions and as you engage the child in activities during assessment. This sounds like a tall order, but actually it becomes second nature once you commit to a capacity building approach to assessment and teaching. As the assessor, you have a critical role when assessing and supporting students who communicate and or behave in an atypical manner. Your responses acknowledge the message of nonverbal communication or any challenging or less typical behavior. And as I said earlier, if you think of behavior potentially as communication, it opens another door into your exploration of why the behavior is happening. It's good to ask I wonder questions. As you comment on what you're observing in the child, remember to point out how the child can communicate and how they can participate and contribute so that you help other people to recognize the child's strengths and interests and contributions. And always remember to point out ways the child can participate in, contribute to, and or help to meet an educational goal. So you're not doing education to the child, but you're including the child in their education. So let's think, I'm moving now more towards the gurus in the field, and especially Jan van Dijk. I would say, if you watch me or Julie at work, or many of our colleagues in the deafblind field, we would have to admit that our view of assessment, first of all, is unusual. It's not commonly encountered in the education world. It's positive. It looks at positive skills and at achievements. It looks at learning styles. It looks at preferences and interests. It looks at the whole child. It credits the child with intelligence. It seeks to improve our understanding of the child. It seeks to help us to build a positive relationship with the child. It seeks to help us to know what to teach and how best to teach it. And it seeks to give us a clear focus for measuring progress. And I would say that the only approach, the only perspective that does these things or gives you the possibility of doing these things is that capacity building framework. I mentioned Jan van Dijk last week, initially because he was the person who first came up with the concept of following the child. It was in 1966, he gave a presentation in which he said, "In the educational atmosphere I describe, the child holds the central position, the teacher follows the child, and when the child responds, the teacher is present to answer the child's request." And follow the child now has become a very, very central concept in the field of deafblindness. And I think it's starting to grow increasingly popular in the whole field of complex and severe disability. Now, what Van Dijk means is that the teacher or the assessor needs to tune into the child, who they are, what they're doing, how they're doing it, and then amend their approach to fit in with what the child seems to be doing or liking or expressing an interest in. It doesn't mean physically following the child. I have to say that because I have heard that people sometimes think you can't follow the child if they're not actively walking yet. And that isn't what Van Dijk is saying. It's more about a philosophical view of the child rather than physically following. Though, of course, if the child is moving around, it is a good idea to follow the child because you won't be able to observe them if they go too far away or if they leave the room. But that isn't what follow the child really means. Van Dijk collaborated with Kathy Nelson, who is in Utah, and they've worked together a lot. And in 2001, they produced a document called Principles of Assessment. And they said that the first steps in the assessment were, first of all, make the child at ease. In other words, you don't want the child particularly stressed, particularly anxious, particularly uncomfortable or suspicious. Make the child at ease. And then determine the child's biobehavioral state. I don't know if you're familiar with that phrase, but I will talk about it a lot more next week when I talk about self-stimulation and self-regulation. What biobehavioral state means is the child's state of arousal. Are they very over-aroused? Are they kind of hyper and a bit manic? Do they seem terribly stressed? Or is their arousal level very low? Are they almost drowsy, almost on the brink of sleep, very unresponsive? Or is their biobehavioral state, is their arousal level more in the middle of those two extremes, which usually, not always, but usually is the best place for the arousal level to be for attendance, attention to what's being taught and what's going on. So learn about biobehavioral states and find a way to determine the child's biobehavioral state. That might mean asking the parent or the teacher or the physical therapist or whoever if they know the child better than you. And by implication, if the child's biobehavioral state is not great, maybe you need to do something to wake them up a bit or calm them down a bit before you start any kind of detailed assessment. Thirdly, determine the child's interest. And then in your assessment, follow the child's interest. And Van Dyke talks about meeting a young girl who was laying on the floor on her back, rocking side to side. And he's told that she loves to rock and it's one of her favorite things to do. So he gets on the floor and he lays next to her and he starts to rock and he matches the pattern. So he's rocking in the same way at the same pace as the child. But he's doing it in a way that occasionally they bump shoulders. And at first the child moves her arm because it's bumping something, but then she starts to move the arm in order to explore what is this next to me? And of course it's him, it's a person. And then gradually he gets in closer and closer physical proximity until they are rocking together, really rocking together. And then he's now fulfilled all four of these requirements. He's following the girl's interest. Then he starts to speed up his rocking to see if he can take her with him. And sure enough, she starts to rock to match him. And then he slows down and she starts to slow down. And in this way, he's starting to get all kinds of information about the child's attentional abilities, about her ability to imitate, about her understanding of the environment around her outside her own body, and about her willingness to have another person enter her world and start to show her things and exert control. That's just one very specific example of something he used to talk about and used to show on video, but it could operate in all sorts of different ways. And then in this document, Van Dyke and Nelson talk further about assessment, and I have emphasized certain phrases with italics and underlining. The foundation of the assessment is the establishment of a relationship with the child and the creation of a secure base that begins with the child's interests and successes. And it is the responsibility of the assessor to adjust his or her emotions, cognitive level, and communications to those of the child. It isn't the child's problem, it's our problem. We're the ones who need to change. We're the ones who need to adjust. And the goal is to start to build a relationship. Not to find out how many signs the child knows, not to find how well their vision focuses at 2 feet or 3 feet or 6 feet on a 1-inch bright red wooden cube. None of those kind of concrete skills is what is the focus is at this beginning stage. Then they say, pre-assessment planning begins by talking with the child's parents to obtain information about the child's history, the child's interests, the child's preferences, the child's motivators. Information is gathered about the child's preferred learning channels, as well as what the child likes and dislikes. You can see a real trend coming out here. Then they say the child's interests guide the process. Therefore, the assessment begins by following the child's interests and movements. And movement is a big part of Van Dyke's assessment approach. It is our hope that by carefully following the lead and interests of children, educators will come to know and understand the children and how they learn, communicate, socialize, and solve problems. I've talked about this in the past, and people, far more often than once or twice, people have said, we just don't have the time to do that. We don't have the time to work in this way. And I'm afraid my answer would be, then your assessment is probably not going to be very thorough, and your teaching is probably unlikely to be very effective unless you're either an absolute genius or the most lucky teacher in the world. I don't know of another way with most of this population to get the assessment and the early teaching right without going along this kind of pathway. I'll divert briefly for one slide away from Van Dyke to David Wiley. David is a deafblind specialist on the Texas State Deafblind Project. He wrote a very brief article called "Where is There Joy in This IEP?" And I've picked out some of the points he makes. He's not necessarily talking about infants. He's talking again about a student all the way through their childhood and their school career. And he suggests, and you see how well this fits with what I'm saying and what Van Dyke is saying, find out what is motivating to the student. Assess to see if the student is enjoying the day at school. Plan activities that incorporate motivating elements for the student. Alternate less motivating activities with ones that create joy. Teach language using highly motivating topics. Teach literacy using highly motivating topics. This is a nice example of the way Van Dyke's ideas and Van Dyke's leadership has infiltrated into the whole deafblind field. Back to Van Dyke. This is the closest, I think, to anything that collects together and crystallizes his approach. I always hoped he would go into more depth, and sadly he died in January of this year, so that won't happen. But this book came out from the American Printing House for the Blind. I can't remember when, possibly 7, 8 years ago. Anyway, in this book, he gets the closest he ever got to outlining his philosophy. And I'm going to riff through about 4 or 5 slides that sum up this approach. He says about his own approach to assessment, it's child-guided, it's fluid, it has no rigid preset structure, it's going to go where it goes, and you need the confidence and the faith to believe that that's a good way of doing it. And it's fluid, of course, because it's child-led, and you don't know quite today how the child's going to be, what they'll be interested in, what they will attend to, and where you'll go when you follow them. It looks at the processes children with multiple disabilities, including sensory impairments, use to learn and to develop. An assessment is summarized in terms of strengths and the next steps for intervention, not in terms of deficits. Then he says, rather than concrete skills of the kind seen in many, many checklists, assessment checklists, he gives us a whole different set of areas that we should be thinking about. What is this child's ability to maintain or modulate their biobehavioral state? In other words, if you can get them to a good level of arousal for attention and relationship building and imitation or turn taking or whatever, can they stay in that state, or do they tend to get hyper aroused or drowsy and under aroused? And do you have to intervene to wake them up or calm them down? Or can they modulate their arousal level themselves? Do they have strategies to waken themselves up or calm themselves down? Which are their preferred learning channels? Vision, hearing, touch, movement. What's their ability to learn, to remember, and to anticipate routines. And a lot of deafblind education is based on individually created routine approaches that are consistent and predictable. Once they've got the routine, what's the child's ability to accommodate new experiences within existing schemes? So rather than the usual routine, you build in a change. You make something different, so the child has to deal with it. You don't want them to go crazy and have a tantrum. Equally, you don't want them to sweep everything off the table and fall asleep because they can't deal with the new experience. But you want them to be able to problem solve. And problem solving might mean asking somebody else for help. That's perfectly legitimate. But the child's problem solving abilities is really a key to understanding their cognitive potential. When I observe children, I'm all the time asking myself, what problems are they having to solve in order to get up and walk? What problems are they having to solve in order to reach across that table and pick the right object from that group of 4 objects for what they need? How are they able to find their own shoes when they come back from a gym session and every child in the class has also removed their shoes and somebody very kindly has mixed all the shoes up together? I mean, again, problem solving can work in all skill areas and in all sorts of different ways. But how is this child solving problems? And there's a major marker of cognitive potential for you. What's the child's ability to form social attachments, relationships, in other words, and interact? And what kind of communication modes seem to work best for the child, both receptively and expressively? He talks about the difficulty with evaluating this approach to assessment. And he's well aware of the difficulty. There's no prescribed protocol. There's no specific implementation order to guide you. There's no set of testing materials. Every assessment is unique, and there's no set interpretation scale. And I would say, from my own experience, I came into the field carrying around several checklists, and I referred to those checklists time and time again. And after about 2.5 years, I realized I'd absorbed an awful lot of those checklists. I didn't need to look at them or even carry them around with me. And I had a different way of thinking and forming opinions about the things I was observing in the child. So it is possible. He talks about his quality indicators, and you'll notice the word respect very clearly. Your approach needs to respect the caregiver, the teacher, the intervener, the parent, or whoever is doing the bulk of the work with the child, which you're possibly not. The importance of respecting the child, the importance of following the child's lead, the importance of communicating with the child in some way that's likely to be meaningful, the importance of utilizing turn-taking routines, and the importance of creating enjoyable routines. And towards the end of his life, in the last couple of years, he talked more and more about the importance of moments of joy. It became a real mantra for him that if we were going to educate effectively, we had to identify existing moments of joy, or we had to know how to introduce and how to create moments of joy for the child. And this obviously fits in very well with those extracts from David Wiley's article that I mentioned earlier. He talks about utilizing turn-taking routines as an extension of communicating with the child. In other words, turn-taking is the very basis of dialogue and conversation. And Van Dyck was trained by a Dutch teacher, Father Van Uden, who created the maternal reflective method, which was really a way of making every interaction with a child conversational. So whatever you do with the child, even if it doesn't involve language as such, you give it the structure of communication, because whatever you do, there are pauses for the child to respond. And whatever the child does, you have to find pauses for you to respond. So that conversational structure is fundamentally important to being with a child with deaf-blindness. And then my last Van Dyck slide, he talks about fidelity. How can you check that you've done the right things and that it's working in your assessment and teaching? First of all, you utilize a stop-start structure within familiar routines. That's the conversational approach. You have to remember to introduce a mismatch with the child's expectations. That's when you're really testing their problem-solving abilities. It's good to return to established routines in order to examine memory, because, as I said last week, memory, especially short-term memory, can be quite a challenge for children with complex multisensory impairments. You have to create situations which allow for problem solving, partly as part of your assessment, but also as a crucial part of your teaching. Often that moment when the child has to solve a new problem is your teaching point as the educator. And you have to remember to utilize varying sensory channels. And I would add to that, utilizing various physical positions, because that's important. And if you want to follow Van Dyck further, I think the best thing to do, as well as acquiring the book, would be to watch these two webcasts. That the Perkins School for the Blind in Massachusetts has masses of useful information on its website, and a growing number of webinars and webcasts. And there are two very wonderful webcasts by Van Dyck. They're quite long. They're about 20, 25 minutes long. One is on child-guided assessment. And the one I especially like is the second one, the role of the emotional brain in the child. And I would highly recommend those. So I'll move on. And the other guru I'm going to talk about is Robbie Blaha. Robbie is also a deafblind teacher with the Texas Deafblind Project. She has an article on the Texas School for the Blind and Visually Impaired website called Thoughts on the Assessment of the Student with the Most Profound Disabilities. And I'm going to go very quickly. I'm looking at the time and thinking I need to go quickly. But I'll go through some of the points she makes, and you can see a close parallel with Van Dyck. She suggests that the most useful assessment questions might be, what range of biobehavioral states is exhibited? Is this a pretty over-the-top, overactive child generally? Or is this a very drowsy, non-responsive child generally? Or can they cover the whole spectrum of arousal levels? What are the most common biobehavioral states in the child? Can the child reach the quiet alert or active alert states? And I'll talk a lot more about arousal next week. Is the child able to maintain this state, or do they slip down and get drowsy or shoot up and get overactive? Are there problems with shifting biobehavioral state, and what variables affect state? In other words, what things inside the child, but also especially what factors outside the child affect their biobehavioral state for better or for worse? Which are the most effective sensory channels for gaining the child's attention? Which are the best sensory channels for conveying reliable information to the child? How much sensory information delivered at what pace helps the child to attend? What channels are associated with orienting reflexes? And she describes the orienting reflex in some detail right at the start of the article. And Robbie is really thinking in this article about children who are profoundly disabled and in most cases would be described as unresponsive or non-responsive children. And she, of course, is questioning that as a descriptive label. And then she says, what did the child used to notice but doesn't notice anymore? Does the child stop responding after 2 or 3 times? In other words, is the child habituating? Do they show a clear response to a sound or a visual input or a touch input consistently on and on? Or do they get used to it and stop reacting to it after 2 or 3 times? And we want them to stop responding because they need to be able to habituate, but they might not be able to do that at the beginning. And I did mention that last week. Does the child seem to associate things or events or people together? Can they match? Oh, this is that person. I'll get excited because this is the one person who takes me swimming, which I love, or whatever. Does the child show anticipation? Does the child show surprise at changes in a familiar routine? Does the child know familiar from unfamiliar people? And there are many, many different ways we can help to answer these questions as we observe and as we play with the child and assess the child. But already I'm sure you're getting the idea that if you follow Van Dyke or you follow what Robbie Blair is saying, these are big jobs, complex jobs, and you could well devote 2 years while you're teaching, but you could devote 2 years to asking these questions and trying to find the answers along with team support from your colleagues. And then she says, what specific voluntary movements does the child exhibit and in what positions? So there she's factoring in possible orthopedic problems and also the fact that the child might just be very immature in their postural control because of multisensory issues. How do different positions affect the child's level of arousal or biobehavioral state? And does transition from one position to another cause significant change in the child's biobehavioral state? And I won't say any more about that, but you can get the article on the internet very easily. And I want to finish up coming on to me in particular. And again, you will see how much I've been influenced by Jan van Dyke. I wrote this article, Follow the Child. I actually wrote it in England in 1997. And then when I moved to California in 2000, I was asked to change it, to expand it, which I did in 2001. And I say in the article that, to me, assessment means having questions. You only assess because there's something you don't know and you want to find out. And to me, that means asking questions. If you don't know something, you ask questions. You might not ask them literally, but in your mind, you have questions and you're seeking the answers. And in the 90s in London, my centre in West London had a good reputation for assessing hard to assess children. And people kept asking to see our assessment tools. And we didn't have assessment tools. We had a classroom, we had toys, we had a dark room, we had a hydrotherapy pool, but we didn't have assessment materials. I mean, everything was an assessment material to us, including ourselves. And that was why I wrote the article in 1997. And I thought, well, okay, I meet a child. I've got basic material on the child. I've seen medical reports. Maybe I've seen the IEP. I've talked to the parent or I've talked to the teacher. But when I actually meet the child, I probably have these 4 questions in my mind right from the beginning. And the questions are about the child. How do you feel? What do you like? What do you want? And what do you do? Now, I'm probably not going to ask those questions literally. I'm not going to go over to the child and say, hello, how do you feel? But in my mind, I want to know how the child's feeling today. And I may well ask that question of the people who know the child well. So the first question tells me, am I meeting the child at a typical time in a typical state? Is this a particularly good day? Is this a disastrously bad day? Did they not sleep last night? Have they just recovered from surgery? Did the family dog die 2 days ago and the child adored the dog, and all those sorts of things? The next question, what do you like, is motivators. And I said that last week, I've said it today, and I'll say it again next week. The importance of knowing the child's motivators so that you can use them in your teaching. You can use them to elicit responses. You can use them to get the child's attention and maintain the child's attention. You can use them to get the child to like you so that you can build a relationship. The third question, what do you want, relates to the child's expressive behaviors. When I meet parents, I'll ask sometimes, how does the child communicate? And the parent might look a little embarrassed. They might laugh and say, well, he can't communicate. And of course, they're thinking of communication in a very narrow sense, a linguistic sense. And they probably are allowing for smiles and eye contact and pointing, but the child isn't doing any of that either. And then as we play and as we talk, the parent might say, oh, he's getting a bit tired now. And I write that down because I want to know how they know, because the child has to have done something to tell them that he's probably getting tired. Or they say, oh, I think he really likes that. Or, oh, I don't think he likes that at all. And after 2 hours or so, I often surprise parents by reading up to a dozen insights they've expressed into their child that are working on an instinctive level that I'm bringing up into their conscious mind, partly to show them that they do actually know their child very well, but also to show that their child has a range of expressive behaviors which have specific meaning, or they have specific meaning in specific contexts. And that's important for me to know. And then the last question is the one I always stress and I like, because I think it's probably the key, is what do you do? And I talked about this excessively last week, so I won't say too much about it. But the child's current behaviors tell you an awful lot about them and who they are. It tells you what they can do. It tells you what they probably like. It tells you what they probably need, or they used to need, and now what they're doing has become habitual. But I would prefer to assume that the behavior reflects a need or a like, an interest, but it could also be habitual by now. And how do they do things? And what children do, I couldn't put a number on it, but I often think when I'm assessing a child and I've got the time to do this, like a couple of hours, what they actively do without me doing anything in, to stimulate responses probably gives me about half of my assessment data by the end of the session. But all too often, what children do is ignored. It's not noticed. It's completely undervalued. It's actively disliked and disapproved of. And I just think we need to rethink those attitudes. I'm going to jump a couple of slides now because of time passing. So bear with me. I'm going to show the slides and then immediately take them away. I'm into paradoxes, and if you come back and watch this on the recording, you'll see the paradoxes I've listed, which I like. I talked last week about the three communications, and the need for the child's brain to be able to communicate with its body effectively, and then the need for their brain to be able to communicate with the immediate environment and the bigger environment. And I think those are really, it's a good way of filtering your view of the child, along with some of the other things I'm pushing at you today. Now I'm going to do a real life case study. This is a child I'd worked with for about 4 years, and she was coming up for triennial, and I got given some of the assessment reports from some of her team. And I was very struck by the deficit assessment that was being done, that was being submitted for the meeting. And I've picked out some fairly representative statements from one or other of these three reports. Refuses to look at faces, dislikes her hands being touched, does not speak or sign, fed by G-tube, low muscle tone and refuses to sit up, sucks her fingers most of the time, refuses to watch other people so cannot imitate, shows no awareness of bowel movements, rocks side to side a lot. I talked about the importance of language and being aware of language. And you'll find the word refuses coming up 3 times there. The word came up much more often in the 3 reports, actually. And this is just, these are a few things I've picked out. But the word refuses is so heavily laden with judgment. First of all, I'm not sure at this stage of development we could tell whether the child was refusing to do something or couldn't do something. And then you see phrases like dislikes, does not, no awareness, rock side to side a lot, sucks her fingers most of the time. Well, she didn't suck her fingers most of the time. She did suck her fingers, but certainly not most of the time. She did rock side to side, but I wouldn't categorize it as a lot. And I have a feeling some of these statements reflect people trying to take this child at a fairly rapid pace through some kind of structured assessment approach, which stimulated the finger sucking, the rocking, the refusal to look at faces. What was being observed was the child's responses to inappropriate approaches to them. I'm guessing there, but that's what I would guess. And then I got my report out, and I apologize for saying how great my report was, but it might not have been great, but my goodness, it tasted so different to the other 3 reports. And this is the way I used language. Likes to be flat on her back, enjoys looking at lights, often kicks her heels hard on the floor, often pats or rubs her hands on her head, grinds her teeth, likes rocking and bouncing, holds objects very close to her eyes for visual scrutiny, enjoys being squeezed hard, moves by back scooting and rolling, travels around familiar areas by back scooting and rolling, but usually returns to the rug next to her mother's chair, loves the family dog, vocalizes more in a smaller room or when underneath a chair or table. And can you see how the language has been deliberately chosen to create a positive impression of the child and what they're doing, rather than a negative impression of what they're doing or not doing? Can you also see that if you have to teach this child, being told she refuses to make eye contact doesn't really give you any idea where to start. But saying that she vocalizes more in a smaller room or underneath a chair or a table does give you an idea of something you might want to start with, because it does suggest that the child is hearing and appreciates the fact that they hear their voice when they're in a confined space, or they hear their voice better because the acoustics make their voice more intense at a higher decibel level in those confined spaces. It suggests that you might want to do some squeezing and rocking with them as part of your relationship building and turn taking. It suggests that you might want to build some of your teaching around dogs. It suggests that the child has a pretty good idea of her mother and where her mother tends to be routinely in the room. If you notice over time that her little journeys usually end up with her coming back to where she started. It suggests that flat on the back might be a good place to work with her at the beginning. It suggests that you might be able to use light in your teaching. It suggests that she likes vestibular and proprioceptive inputs. You know, all these things jump out of these comments that I don't get from the comments from the other reports. And I'm very much a teacher assessing and reporting in order to open doors to possibilities for working with the child. I want to conclude by thinking about what do we do with our assessment data. All too often, assessment data goes into a long, very wordy report. It's often all text, although I was recently given a functional vision report that was crammed with photographs taken by the vision teacher. It was absolutely beautiful. It was very positive. It was totally capacity building. And the teacher had very cleverly selected her own photographs to demonstrate points that she was making in the report. It was just beautiful. But generally, we have a lot of text, very lengthy reports, often with a lot of jargon. Often the structure of the report is to fit in with some kind of institutional directive about the way these things are to be structured. Often the reports go into a ring binder on a shelf and they're never seen again. Or if they are seen, it's only by the class teacher in many cases. And one idea I want to talk about is personal passports. There is an article in the handouts called Knowing the Child, where I write about personal passports. And I've got some examples. I've been given permission by families. Basically, the idea is that the family, together with the professional team, collaborates to say, let's write a little book about this child, to introduce the child to someone who's a stranger, who's a newcomer, to give them fairly quickly and fairly easily and fairly accessibly an idea of who this child is, what they like, what works for them, and how you as a stranger can introduce yourself to them and get to know them. And there's no pro forma for this. There's no set structure. And I encourage families with their teams to do it their way. And sometimes the end result, I don't think is that great. Sometimes the end result is quite mind-blowing and I'm overwhelmed. And I've just got a couple of examples to show you. This is a young man who I've only met once. but his parents produced an absolutely stunning personal passport. It was organized by topics, and this is the communication page. And it says things like, I communicate mainly with my physical and facial expressions. When I'm a happy boy, I wiggle my arms up and down and smile. Sometimes my whole body gets in the groove and I do a wiggle dance. I do laugh rarely. You can just not hear it because of my trachea tube. When I'm mad, I kick my left leg hard and purse my lips. I sometimes cry when I'm angry. I won't go on, but you get an idea of the flavor of this. It's intensely personal, intensely individualized, and this is an outcome of assessment. It's not dry, it's not standardized, it's not deficit-based, but it's a result of a long-standing, detailed assessment of this child over a long period of time. And at the bottom, something I'd never thought of, they've got photographs of him demonstrating certain emotional states: happy, not happy, content, and my favorite, nervous, just to help this hypothetical stranger. Then there's a page about his hearing. They talk about his cochlear implant. There's a page on his orthopedic issues, and he has a prosthetic leg. There's a page on vision, a page on feeding, and so on. It's very detailed. And then this is a young lady, an older child who I know, Stephanie. She was able to collaborate on the book with her parents. And she loves animals, and her mother picked the picture for the front page. And it is a beautiful picture. And Stephanie's one of those children who's very beautiful to look at, doing quite well academically. She's now 16 or 17 years old and loves Zumba. And she's now a Zumba teacher at the age of 17. But in the book, the photographs, I always recommend photographs. She wanted these kind of photographs showing terrible surgical scars from her early infancy. And her mother, I remember her mother emailing me and saying, she wants those kind of pictures. Well, I don't think that's a good idea. What do you think? And I said, well, first of all, it's her personal passport. But secondly, think about, why does she want those photographs? And her mum talked to her and got back to me and said, she thinks it's important because she's come such a long way. And I thought, yes, let's think about self-determination here. And more I'm finding, when children are able to be actively involved in creating their passport, they want people to know that they were in the NICU for 12 months. They want people to know that they used to have a G-tube, or they used to have a trach, or that they still have a trach, and this is a photo of it, and this is why I have it, and so on. And again, she talks about feeding, how she moved on to oral feeding. And she wanted the messy picture. Her mom wanted her eating very nicely with a spoon. And Stephanie felt that she should show that she ate with her hands and made a mess, and then got better at it. And there's a page about hearing and balance issues. And then this is a young man, again, I've met several times, and I'm now in touch with his mom on Facebook a lot. She took this approach, but she produced a pamphlet, and it's wonderful. It's just a trifold, as you can see, and it's a quick introduction to who he is, important things to know about me, what works for me, vision for Gannon. This is what I'm aiming for in my life. There are other approaches, other ways of using assessment data, and I've put these two links up. The Perkins School for the Blind link on creating vocational portfolios for adolescents could be of interest. And the National Centre on Deaf-blindness has a whole huge section on assessment, which includes a couple of things on these kinds of outcomes that can be used effectively. And as I mentioned, the National Centre on Deaf-Blindness, I would recommend you go to their website because it contains lots of good material. And then 2 more slides. The home talk, a family assessment of children who are deaf-blind, would be of great interest to you. It's very much a collaborative team approach with the family, with the professionals, to get this kind of profile of the child, and the communication matrix, which many of you will already be using probably, which could be very effective. And I think it's good to regard assessment as a process, an ongoing process, rather than a product. Don't worry about trial and error. I think that means you're doing it right. And if you're making it child-guided and fluid, you'll be okay as long as you stick with it. It should always be a work in progress. The right questions will lead you to the right answers. So focus on your questions and always remember the reason why you're assessing. And at that point, I will finish. It's 5 o'clock. My dog is just starting to make a noise. And thank you for being with me. And I look forward very much to joining you for the last of these webinars next week.
So David, this is Robin, and I want to thank everybody for joining us. I love this topic, and I love hearing you talk about it. So many things that I think people will go away from the webinar thinking about how they approach, how they look at children and assess children. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Please complete the evaluation for us, and we will see you next week. Good night.